Amazing. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Shiur. I'm glad that everybody's here. I hope you had a good week, a healthy week, a week full of blessing, maybe even simcha. But tonight we're going to be taking a look, or actually we're going to be starting, it's on a sad note. The Parsha is Chayei Sara. Somebody asked me, Robin asked me a couple of weeks ago, if maybe at the beginning of this year, what I could do is just give a brief overview of what's in the Parsha, which is a really good idea. So this week's Parsha, I think it's easy because there are only three actually main topics in Parshat Chayei Sara. The first topic is the death of Sara, followed by Abraham's challenges to bury her. That's topic number one. We'll talk a little bit about that. Topic number two is Abraham's efforts to find a wife for Yitzchak. And that's the whole story of Eliezer, her servant, who's go back home to where Abraham came from, finds Rivka, all the stories there, and the travel back where she meets Yitzchak. That's actually the longest narrative in the Torah, the longest single story. It covers such a big piece of real estate in the Torah. That's topic number two. And topic number three is Abraham's second marriage. He marries again at the very end of the Parsha, Keturah, and he has multiple children from this marriage, whom he then sends away. He gives gifts to and sends them away. And therein lies the end of Parashat Chayei Sara. Three topics. I don't think we'll be able to do all three of them in depth, but I picked some things that I think, hopefully, I have found interesting, some moving, and I hope that you will appreciate that as well. So the way in which I study, we learn together, is you don't have to have a chumash, but you're certainly welcome to have one open should that be helpful to you. So I'm going to start. And we're starting right at the very beginning of Parshat Chayei Sara, which in the Torah is Perek Chaf Gimel Pasuk Aleph. So here it is, first reading from the Torah, from Hebrew, and then we'll do the English interpretation translation. Vayihiyu Chayei Sara, Meya Shana, Ve'esrim Shana, Ve'sheva Shanim, Shenei Chayei Sara. Sarah's lifetime was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years, the years of Sarah's life. So let's just pause for a second. I think the words are easy, but it's not just the words that usually not just the words, that we need to stop and consider the meaning of words, but the way in which something, the style, the methodology is also something that requires us to pause, certainly through the traditional rabbinic lens. So just let's hear again the way in which the Torah wanted us to know how old Sarah was when she passed away. Vayihiyu Chayei Sara, and Sarah's lifetime was Meya Shana, 100 years, Esrim Shana, 20 years, and Sheva Shanim, 7 years. So that's not a very elegant way of saying it. And a more elegant way was Meya Sheva Esrim Shana, 127 years old. But as you can see, the Torah sort of deliberately breaks it up into hundreds, tens, and units. Meya Shana, 100 years, Esrim Shana, 20 years, and then Sheva Shanim. It's unusual. As I said, it's not economical. The Torah, generally speaking, often or almost always chooses to use fewer words than more. So this is not, that's not that choice. It adds more language than necessary. So why do that? So here we find a fascinating, find a whole bunch of different interpretations. I'm going to share a few of them with you tonight. Concentrating, yes, on the very first pasuk, because I think there's some ideas here that I want to talk about. And one of the things I just want to do is we spend so much time talking about Avram Avinu, especially in Lech Lecha and last week's Parsha with the Akedah, and we don't spend as much time talking about Sarah. But I think that there's a few things, ideas, the Torah wants us to consider about Sarah Imenu, and that's what I want to do. So first of all, the idea of juxtaposition, Smichut Parshiot, the end of last week's Parsha and the beginning of this week's Parsha. So just from the story that's actually recorded last week and this week, there is no evident source for Sarah's passing. It doesn't say anything. We end the Akedah last week, and at the beginning of this week's Parsha, she dies at the age of 127. But because the idea of juxtaposition, Smichut Parshiot, plays a pretty significant role in the way in which our Chachamim understood and interpreted Torah. It's not surprising that our Chachamim, here it's quoted by Rashi, saw that there is a connection between last week's and this week's. What's the connection? That because of what happened last week, Sara passed away, meaning that in a manner that is undisclosed in the explicit text, but is a part of the oral tradition, Sara found out what had happened. And the overwhelming, I'll say, shock of nearly losing her son caused her to die. It was just too much for her heart. It was too much for her soul. And she passed away. So the Chachamim see that there is a connection, and we're going to explore that connection just a little bit more in a little while. So when the Torah talks about Sara Imenu and describes the fact that she was 127, what is it that we're supposed to understand? So here's where Rashi quotes a Midrash. The Midrash suggests that by breaking up 127 the way it did, the Torah wants us to examine, or to at least create a linkage between 120 and 7, that there's something about that three-way division that we should think about. And so Rashi tells us the following: Bat kuf kevat chaf lachet, that the Torah wants us to understand that when she was 100 years old, kuf, she somehow was the same as she was when she was 20 years old regarding sin, which suggests that there is something about Sarah which is so pure, so genuine, so honest, that even as she aged, the effect of aging didn't change the type of person she became. That may not be true for all of us, but as she was pure in her youth, so was she pure in her old age. So 100, that's why the age of 100 was set aside to tell us that 100 needs to be understood. She was as pure as 100 as she was when she was 20 regarding Chayei. Ma bat kaf lo chata, just like at the age of 20, she hadn't sinned. So too, af bat kuf lo chet, so too was she when she was 100. Ubat chaf kivat zayin liyofi. And what about the last two, the 20 and the 7? Well, at the age of 20, she was as pretty, she was as fetching as she was when she was 7. And if you take a look, of course, at the face of a 7-year-old girl, how pretty, the skin is clean and pure, and that light, that radiance, well, that was Sara Imenu. So externally and spiritually, there was something about her that remained pure and genuine throughout her entire life. And so, say the Chachamim quoted by Rashi, that's the reason for 120 and 7. Rabbi Yehuda Amital was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush in Israel. It serves to this very day as one of the major yeshivot, Hesder yeshivot, that promotes a sort of religious Zionist view of the world. And so many students, and from our city and major schools across the world, when boys graduate high school, they often go to Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush and to study Torah. So it's a very prominent yeshiva. And Rav Amital himself was a really deep thinker, a Holocaust survivor, and he later then approached Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, Rav Soloveitchik's son-in-law, to be his co-Rosh Yeshiva, and the two of them continued to do so. Rav Amital passed away before Rav Aaron afterwards, and now, of course, the yeshiva continues under the leadership of other rabbis. So I just want to share with you a fascinating spin on this that Rav Amital provides, understanding what the Chachamim wanted us to know about Sara. And what he asks us to consider is a midrash. So when the midrash takes a look at this pasuk that we just read, she was 100 years old, she was 20 years old, she was 7 years old. The midrash, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to read it in the English. The midrash quotes a pasuk from Sefer Tehillim, and this is the pasuk in English that the midrash quotes, meaning that the midrash thinks that this pasuk in Sefer Tehillim has something for us to understand and figuring out what the first pasuk in the parsha is. Here's the pasuk: the Lord knows the days of the wholehearted, and the word wholehearted in Hebrew is timimim, and their inheritance shall be forever. So the Midrash says when David Melech wrote that pasuk, Hashem knows the days of the wholehearted, the Tmimim. Who's Hashem thinking? Who is this pasuk talking about? Who are these Tmimim? Midrash says this refers to Sara, who was whole, Tmimah in her actions. So let's just stop a second. What this Midrash is saying is that Sara is what's called a Tmimah. So let me just make sure that we understand the word Tmimah. Tmimah is a positive attribute. We may think about it in the context of the Pesach Haggadah, where we have the Arba Banim, the Chacham, the Rasha, and then there's the Tam, that's the masculine form. Tmimah would be the feminine form. Now, the word Tam in the Arba Banim is not a criticism. In fact, it could be what the Midrash is referring to. There's something special about a Tam. There's something whole. There's something genuine. There's something, and I'm saying this not in a negative way. It could be something simple. Sometimes we add layers of so much complexity into our lives and whatever it is that we do that it makes us stuck because things are so complex, when really there may be a kernel of simplicity that could guide us, and we get stuck because we're making too much out of something. But according to the Midrash, Sarah is a Timimah. That's 100, 120, and 7. She is a Timimah. So here's where Rabbi Amital adds, I think, a really fascinating thing. So when we know the story of Sara, at one point in the story, especially when it comes to the story of Yitzchak and Ishmael playing together, you remember the story. One day, Sarah looks out of her window of the tent and she watches the two boys playing. And she determines, after watching, that is inappropriate. It's not good for the two boys to grow up together. She turns to her husband and she says to him, "You need to garesha tamahazot get bana. You have to kick out this woman," referring to Hagar, "and you need to send out her son as well." Of course, it's not just her son; it's Avraham's son. But be that as it may. Now, Sarah, according to the Torah, Abraham was not happy about this until Hashem says to Sarah, "Shema b'kolah," you have to listen to Sarah's voice. She's right. And from here, the Chachamim learn, Rashi quotes, that Sarah, in fact, seems to be on a higher prophetic level than Abraham Avinu. That somehow, by virtue of the fact that God says to Abraham, listen to her voice, that could be interpreted that Sarah was a greater prophet. Now, where did Sarah become a prophet? Like a prophet is somebody who God speaks to. So throughout the Chumash, at least from the beginning of Parsha Lech Lecha, we know where Abraham became a prophet because Parsha Lech Lecha begins with Hashem speaking to Abraham. But if the Chachamim were going to call Sarah a prophetess and Neviah, so where in the narrative that we know about Abraham and Sarah did she actually become a Neviah? That's not so clear. One of the answers given is in Perek Yud Chet, in Perek 18, in Pasuk Yud Gimel to Tetvav. And I'm just gonna, you don't have to turn back with me, but it's a story of when the angels come and they promise that they're going to have a baby. And you may remember the following. But Titzchak Sara b'kirba. Sara started laughing when she said, "Acharei veloti haitali ednava adoni saken." Listen, I know how old I am. I'm not going to be able to biologically conceive a child. And my husband, Adoniza, and he's old. Like what's going on here? Well, Yomer Shem al Abraham. So Abraham, Shem says to Abraham, "Lama zetzachaka Sarah limor ha'afum lamele v'nizakante." Why did Sarah laugh, saying, "How can I possibly give birth to a child? I'm too old." So God is speaking to Abraham, and asking Abraham, "Why do you think she laughs?" Hashem davarkin. Is there anything that God cannot do? Is there anything that He can't possibly do? But Sarah lemor. But Sarah denied this, and she said, "Lo tzachakti." I didn't laugh. So some of the Meforshim say that challenge, like why did she laugh, is a challenge that God said not to Abraham only, but to Sarah. So that would be the single time, the only time in the narrative where Hashem spoke to Sarah, rendering her a Navi, a Neviah. And in this week's Parsha, in the Parsha where she tells Abraham to send out Hagar and her son, and God says, listen to her, and the derived lesson that she is of a greater prophetic nature than he is, that's the basis for this. So Rabbi tells us something interesting, I think. He says he wants to offer a different interpretation. When the Midrash calls her Tzmimah, somebody pure, it's not describing her prophetic ability. It's describing something else. And here's his words in English. They are telling us that Sarah was closer to God, specifically by virtue of her simple innocence. That's what the Midrash was saying. She was a Tzmimah. So when the Torah tells us you had to listen to Sarah, Rabbi Amital says it's because somehow of her simple innocence, her pure human senses. When she sees what influence Ishmael is having on Yitzchak, she identifies him as a negative element and tells Abraham that Hagar and her son must be sent away, says Rabbi Amital. God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah not because she was a great prophetess, but rather because she, with her simple maternal instincts, was better attuned to the situation at home than was Abraham, the great prophet. The Torah is telling us, and I think this is a really wonderful phrase that he comes up with in his understanding. The Torah is telling us that in order to be close to God, one does not have to be a prophet or even a great sage. A simple, guileless person can also achieve closeness to God. So it's a completely different take on the story that he's saying. And he's questioning the idea, oh, she was a great prophet. And she's saying, and Rabbi Amital is saying, maybe what made her great was not her prophecy, not because somehow God had a close relationship with her, but she saw things. She saw things because she opened her heart and watched and thought and considered things. She did so with a genuine openness about her. And that's what the Midrash is saying. She was a Tzmimah, not because she was a prophetess, but because she watched and she let her humanness, as it were, guide her. The Torah is telling us that in order to be close to God, one doesn't have to be a prophet or a great sage. A simple, guileless person can also achieve closeness to God. It's a different take. And maybe that's what made Sarah great. Abraham was great in his arena. Abraham was great in the things that he did, and she was great in the things that she did. And even being that person, she was able to exert tremendous influence over people. Maybe Abraham was able to create that community of believers because of his ability to explain complicated philosophical notions in a manner that people would understand. That's a tremendous accomplishment. But maybe Sarah was able to create a community of believers, not because of her ability to explain and her philosophic prowess, but because of the type of person she was, that people felt she connected on a different level. And so sometimes I think we don't pay enough attention to one of those people. And sometimes I think that that quality that Rabbi Amital says Sarah had, sometimes we don't give it the proper significance. So that's the first shot, the first idea that I want to share with you. Here's the second one that I want to share with you, and it's still about the first pasuk. There's a lot in this pasuk, and I'm going to try to share a few ideas. I know it means we're going to be focusing on only one pasuk for a bit, but I think there's a lot to unpack, and as I've said, I think there's a lot to learn from Sarah, and we sometimes don't spend enough time doing that as we go through the narrative, and we let Abraham, as he should, take a prominent place. But I don't know if we give Sarah the prominence that I think she deserves. So I want to go back to this notion that the Chachamim posited, that Rashi teaches, that almost everybody quotes, that there was this linkage between her 100 years, her 20 years, and her 7 years. So Rashi told us that she was at the age of 100 the way she was when she was 20. Okay. Rav Yosef Zevin, was a great Talmid Chacham, and actually he was the one who authored something called the Encyclopedia Talmudit, tremendous Talmid Chacham. But he also wrote some ideas, some of his thoughts on the Parsha in a sefer called Torah Moadim. And in his series of, he doesn't write long essays, he offers a few ideas in every Parsha. He says something fascinating, I think, about this Midrash that Rashi quotes, and he says he thinks it's backwards. Because the way it's structured, in the traditional way, and the way I've explained it up until now, there's a linkage between 120, that she was, again, if we just listen to the way it is written, excuse me, she was at 100 the way she was at 20. And that sounds like, in the plain meaning, or the way it's mostly presented, is a compliment. And Rab Zevin says, that's not a compliment in my mind. Why not? Because if you think about our lives' journeys, sometimes we do stupid things when we're 20. We do. We make mistakes. We don't always have the type of thinking that we should have. We're only 20 years old. We're just 20 years old. So if you're going to say that at 100, she was like 20, is that a compliment? Maybe not. Maybe that's not really such a nice thing to say. At 100, she still acted like she was 20. And if you go back and take a look at some of the things that she did or people do when they're 20, that's not always such a good thing. So maybe we need to sort of revisit this linkage and understand it in a different way. Who do you think is more likely or more prone to sin, the 20-year-old or the 100-year-old? And Rabbi Zevin says he thinks it's the 20-year-old. Okay, so if that's the case, so why do our sages, quote, Rashi quotes them, structure the explanation the way that they did? So, and this is the idea that he says. I'll read it in Hebrew, this fun phrase. Siman shelo tamid hazikna mishameshet semel litzdakot. Velo tamid hanoar mishamesh semel lara. Because sometimes old age or advanced years or the senior years of our lives don't always serve as a symbol, as a symbol for righteousness, and youthfulness does not always serve as a symbol for evil. Meaning that maybe we have to see that there really is a different type of interplay between the number 100, which obviously represents an older age, and the number 20. Because sometimes there could be people who are 100 years old who don't strike us as being so virtuous. And sometimes there are people who are 20 years old, symbolizing youth, who don't always strike us as being lacking understanding, depth, and maturity of thought. And what Rabbi Zevin is saying is that maybe the Torah structured what it had to say this way in order to make us think about and compare the various stages of people's lives, the notion of old age and the notion of youth. The Gemara makes a fascinating comment. The word for a elder in Hebrew is a zaken, zayin kuf nun. And the Gemara says that the word itself, zaken, zayin kuf nun, is an acronym. It stands for a phrase, ze shekana chokhmah, a person who has acquired chokhmah, wisdom. So why? Because ostensibly, the older you get, the more wisdom you acquire. But Rabbi Zevin points out, but think about what the Gemara just said, and you'll notice something fascinating. He says, I can understand that the rabbis want to create this acronym, but Zakein is made up of 3 letters, but only 2 of them form that phrase, Ze Kana Chochmah. Zayin of Zakein, Kana, acquired, is the Kuf of Zakein, Ze Kana, but there is no Chochmah. There is no letter in the word Zakein which is representing the word Chochmah. So he says that in some ways, of course, that's a sort of a message for us. Sometimes old age just means you're intransigent. Sometimes old age means that you don't want to consider changing. Sometimes old age means you've been doing something so long that you don't want to consider doing it any other way. This is the way my parents did it. This is the way I do it. And this is the way you're going to do it. How many times have we heard something like that? It could be from our teachers. It could be from our family members. It could be just a general concept in society. Sometimes people reach a point in their lives where the idea of doing things differently is just not welcome. Whereas a younger generation who is not entrenched and has not yet developed this sort of sense of being obliged to do something the same way, they feel freer. They feel more liberated to considering other ways. And then Rabbi Zevin does something fascinating. He actually sort of takes us through a mini tour of some verses. And one of the most famous verses is this, and I really think it's worth just hearing this verse. Hine anochi sholech lachem et, this is, by the way, a famous haftorah. Hine anochi sholech lachem et Eliyahu Hanavi. I hereby am going to be sending to you Eliyahu Hanavi. The Heshiv, listen to this, the Heshiv leiv avot al banim, and he will return the hearts of fathers on their sons, the leiv banim al avotam, and the heart of the sons on the fathers. Heshiv leiv avot al banim, he will return the heart of fathers on the sons and return the heart of sons onto the fathers. So says Rabbi Zevin, if you were to ask somebody, what does that actually mean? The sons, yashuvu al ha'avot, does it mean that the sons are going to help the parents return, or are the parents going to help the children return to where they should be? Most of us are going to say, oh, it's obvious. The parents, the wise ones, the experienced ones, the ones who've undergone so many things, they're going to be instructive. They're going to be helpful in making sure that the sons, the children, the young generation will return to do what they need to do, because after all, we're the parents, we're the wise ones, we know what. And Rashi, commenting on this pasuk, says the exact opposite. No, it's not that. It's that the children will help the parents return to where they should be. Says Rav Zevin, you got to think about that. You got to think about that. And perhaps this whole structure of the 100, the 20, and the 7 is to make us stop and think, so what does it mean, the relationship between 100 and 20? Who's influencing who? Who's more like who? Is it better to be at 100 the way you were when you were 20? Or are there people who at 20 know more than people who are at 100? Having worked in schools, and not even just in schools, and Jewish community for all my life, and maybe from the people in your circles, there have been so many cases, and I've seen this, of children at different ages of their lives who have led a life which is not really connected to Yiddishkeit, and something happens to them, and they want to change. But it's harder for them to make the change on their own because they're still living at home. And so they go to their parents, and slowly, something fascinating happens. It's the kids who are influencing the parents to make the changes in their lives. So the young man or the young girl comes home and says, you know what? I think we should light Shabbos candles. And because of what the little girl says she learned in school, if she saw somewhere, they start lighting Shabbos candles. And you can see the scenario. This is how things begin. And that's precisely what the pasuk in the Haftorah is, v'heshiv leiv avot al banim, that it's the children who are sometimes pushing or pulling or directing or energizing the path of growth that happens to people and families and configurations. And therefore, it says Rav Zevin, maybe that's what you have to take away. And that's a really important idea. We can't become stuck. We know better, and so therefore we don't have to listen. That is a danger that sometimes happens when we reach a certain point in our life. So that's the second thing that I wanted to share when it comes to this first pasuk. But I want to go to one more idea. And this one really touched me, like deeply, and I want to share it with you. So at the beginning of tonight's class, I suggested why there may be a connection between the end of Parsha Vayera and the beginning of Parsha Chayei Sara. What was the connection? The connection was a Akedat Yitzchak. That a message somehow was sent by, although it's not in the text, somebody who knew about the Akedah made his way to Sara, Imenu, told Sara about what transpired at Har HaMoriah, and the shock of all of that, her imagination, thinking about what all of it could have ended up with, she passed away. So it's not talked about a lot, but the fact that Sarah died in that way, what do we learn about Sarah? So everybody calls the event at the end of last week's Parsha, Perek Chayei, call it Akedat Yitzchak. Okay, why? Well, Yitzchak was bound. His father did that, 100%. Why isn't it Akedat Avraham? Whose test was this? Was it a test for Avraham? Was it a test for Yitzchak? It's called the binding of Isaac. It's a test. But why do we not attribute this as a test to Sarah? Isn't she the third person here? And she really doesn't get included in our conversation so much. But was she tested as well? Was Sarah tested? I know explicitly in last week's Parsha that it says, V'Elokim nisad Avraham. That much we know. God tested Avraham. Him, specifically. I got it. But was that test of what Avraham did to Yitzchak de facto also a test for Sarah? And if you come to the conclusion, well, maybe you have to say that it was a test because look at what happened at the end. She was deeply affected by this. She was so deeply affected by that she lost her life. She died. And if that is the case, what was the result of the test? Would you say that Sarah passed the test or she didn't? Is Sarah a woman of weakness because she died? Or is Avram Avinu, he didn't die. He was told explicitly what to do, and he somehow was able to find his way through this very, very deep and difficult and dark moment, and he came out of it with God's blessings. But what happened to Sarah? She didn't come out of it with God's blessings. She lost her life. So it's a difficult question. And as I said, I think sometimes we just don't stop and think about Sarah as much as we ought to, because there's so much for us to learn about her as there is about Avraham, or maybe not as much, but there certainly is things that we should stop. So I want to share with you an idea by Rabbi Ben-Sion Führer in his collection of short essays in the Parsha, a Hegyunah Shel Torah.
Tell me those bag of that. There should be another bag of it, soft bag. And the pantry.
Everybody, sorry.
Oh, closet.
So he was also involved in setting up the rabbinical ordination program Yeshiva Kereb B'Yavne many years ago. A brilliant Talmid Chacham, also a very creative thinker. And so in his essay on this week's Parsha, his collection of little short essays called Hegyunah Shel Torah, he addresses this question. And he says the following. And I'm going to read part of it and translate. I found his use of language, the way he structured it, it's really powerful. I found it personally very moving. Hayim hayta Sara pechuta be'inyan ze me'Avraham v'lo amda b'nisayon shehu kein amad bo? Was Sarah somehow lesser of a person? Was she lesser in her accomplishment than her husband, who also was tested and apparently passed the test? In fact, the Mishnah Masechet Avot says that throughout his life, Avram was tested 10 times, and he passed, as it were, each and every one of those 10 tests. This is definitely one of the tests. Some say it was the 10th test, some say it was the 9th test, but be that as it may, all opinions say that the Akedah was a test. So he passed it according to the Mishnah. But what happened to Sarah? Did she not? Lo, he says, you cannot come to the conclusion that Sarah's death, when lost her soul when she heard the idea, you cannot You cannot conclude that somehow she was on a diminished level. Ki nisayon ze haya yoter gadol etzel Sara Yasher etzel Abraham. This is an amazing comment. He says, because the test for Sarah was a greater test than it was for Abraham. Why? I'm not going to read the whole thing in Hebrew, but I will read parts of it. Because he says, listen for one moment. Think for 1 second about what the test was. You may remember the language in the beginning of Parakhav Beit in last week's Parsha, where God comes to Avram and says, I want you to take your son, your only son, the one whom you love, Yitzhak, and I want you to sacrifice him. But at the time that God came to Avram and demanded that he perform this test, Avram had 2 sons. He had Yitzhak and he did have Yishmael. Sarah didn't have another son. This was the only son that she had. This was the son that she was going to bring into the world. This was the son that was going to make up her future and her husband's future. And so to say to Sarah, your test is equal to Avram, says Rabbi Ben Seinfir, it's not true. Because Abraham had another son, and not to say that you have to pit one son to the other, but Abraham's internal experience of this, what he saw as a loss, was not the same, because at the end of the day, he knew that he was the father of 2 children, and Sarah was the mother of only one. And therefore, her test was greater than his. כנראה שניסיונה גדול כל כך, שאין הוא לפי כוחו של אדם, ואפילו צדקת כשרה. What a statement. And apparently, says Rabbi Ben Seinfir, that the test was so great that it's not possible to withstand it, even if you are as righteous as Sarah was. And then he says something that honestly I had never really thought of. This part is, I want to read it. ואולי משום כך לא נתנסה אברהם בניסיון העקידה על ידי ישמעאל, לפני שנולד יצחק. And maybe, he suggests, perhaps it's for this reason that Avram was not tested with the test of the Akedah about Yishmael before Yitzchak was born. Ela al yedei Yitzchak shishmael nolad lefanav. It's a fascinating idea. Why did God, if God wanted to test Abraham in whatever way this test was intended to prove, why didn't he test Abraham when only Ishmael was alive, before Yitzchak was born? Ki akedah kazo shel yichidcha mamash hu nisayon kashet. Because testing somebody in this idea, take the son that you love, your only son, which at that point would have been Ishmael, was just too hard of a test. She'ena kadosh baruch hu menaseh bo afilu tzaddik Avram, because God would never test anybody, even Avram, this great righteous man. It just wasn't a reasonable test. You couldn't do that to Avraham. Because this test was greater than any strength and resilience of any human being. Now, honestly, that's such a fascinating idea. Because when do we ever think of Sarah's test as being greater than Abraham's? And such a great test can't be endured. And if it, maybe that's why Abraham was never tested with just Ishmael. What a fascinating, I find that fascinating. But it's also, in a way, there's a sadness about that. There's a question, and I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions about, so then why did Sarah die? Is that something that's not fair? Maybe you're asking that question, but it's something that goes through my mind. I'm just going to read a little bit more because I think it's just so worthwhile. לגבי שרה יכול הטועה לטעות ולומר שהיא לא עמדה באותו ניסיון שהוא. And so maybe somebody who reads the story and makes the link between the end of last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha, where Sarah dies as a result of what happened then, about the Akedah, maybe somebody would be mistaken and think to themselves that she was not able to withstand the test. Aram could withstand the test, Sarah couldn't. She's weaker, she's diminished. And therefore she died when she found out about the Akedah. Ve'ilu hu akad b'mo yadav. When Abraham, he himself with his own hands, tied up his own son. And therefore, he look what he had to go through. Obviously, he's on a higher madrig, he's on a higher level. Therefore, says Rabbi Ben Sion Führer, the Torah came to testify and to be very clear that all the years of Sarah's life were equal. They were all good, 127. But Kuf, like we went through, Ein ze choser emunah. She had no lack of faith. She had no lack of faith. We should never say that Sarah's faith changed when she got older. No, she died because of a lack of faith. No, 127. Her faith in God never wavered, even at this moment. Because anybody, even the person with the greatest faith, would have a hard time withstanding what she had to withstand. Her test was greater than his. And therefore, he says, and I'll conclude this part of the shiur with this, maybe that's the reason that the Torah tells us that when she died, Abraham came to eulogize her, lispod l'Sara. Doesn't say that about Yaakov, who we know really loved Rachel, right? We know the whole story of Abraham, Leah, and Rachel. Yeah, not Abraham. Yaakov, Leah, and Rachel. He wanted Rachel. Laban cheated him. He married Leah, but he really was, his beloved wife was Rachel. When Rachel died, the Torah doesn't tell us that Yaakov eulogized her. He loved her. We know that. He buried her. But it doesn't say he cried over her. It doesn't say he eulogized her. It's just Abraham eulogizing Sarah. Why? Perhaps as an indication to show that lest anybody think that somehow Sarah was not as great as he was, he wanted to show that through his public mourning and crying. I just found that to be such a fascinating peek into this idea of Abraham and Sarah, who this is it's such a difficult story. And that question about tests and what you can endure and what you can't endure, it's a difficult one. And I'm not going to stand here tonight and tell you I have the definitive answer about that. I don't know. It certainly raises a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions as a child of Holocaust survivors, both myself and my wife, all the stories we know. Maybe some of you know stories about people who did endure things, didn't endure things, or some people stronger than others and weaker than others. I just don't know. But I was a brave thing that Rabbi Führer raised, and I just found it fascinating. I want to share with you tonight. And at the end of this year, maybe we can chat a little about what you think about that. So I'm going to go a little bit further in the Parsha. We're going to skip to chapter Chav Dalet. So I reminded there's 3 parts to the story. So part 1 was the burial of Sara in Hebron. And by the way, one comment about that, and I've said this comment before, but it's really important to state this, especially in light of so many political upheavals in our history here as well, of course, in beloved Israel. The story is very clear that when Avram wanted to bury Sarah in Maran Machpelah, which is in the property of somebody else, and he went and approached the person who owned the property, person who owned the property initially recognizing Avram's greatness, and he was a very well-known person in the area, a wealthy man, a man of great influence, a man of great status. And the owner of the field, Ephron Nahiti, says to Avram, on my honor, if you just bury your family here, you can take the land, I'm going to give it to you as a gift. And Ephron says, I don't want it as a gift. I want to buy it. And so Ephron charged him an exorbitant amount of money, 400 pieces of silver. 400 pieces of silver, an exorbitant amount of money, then probably even today. And Avram insists on buying it. It's one of 3 properties mentioned in the Tanakh that our ancestors bought. And this, of course, we're talking about Hebron, the holy city of Hebron. This wasn't simply a gift, but the Torah records that there was a transaction. There was a purchase. It was a legal purchase, as the Torah tells us, that Avram bought Hebron. Ma'arat HaMachpelah was bought by Abraham, and Abraham, passed this property on to his descendants. So is there a claim to Hebron? The Torah says, of course there's a claim to Hebron. not just because God created the world and he said, I want the Jewish people to inhabit Israel, and I, God, the creator of the world, say so, and therefore because I say so, it's going to be so. According to the Torah, it's that because there was a legitimate transaction that took place between two people. One is called Ephron, one is called Avram. That's part of the claim, not a small part, that we bought the land. So after the story of burial of Sara is finished, the Torah tells us that Avraham then turns his attention on a different topic. The Avraham Zakein Babayamim. Hashem Berach et Avraham Bakol. Now Avraham was old, well on in years, and Hashem had blessed Avraham with everything. And this begins the story of Avraham's decision to be active in finding a wife for Yitzchak, ending up, of course, in the story of Rivka. But I just want to go back to this pasuk. Avraham Zakein, Baba Yamin. Avraham was old, well on in years. I want to share with you a midrash. It's a fascinating midrash. And it's about that phrase, Avram Zakein Baba Yamin. Avram was old. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon stated, Avraham Tava Zikna. Avraham asked for. He asked God for old age. Amar Lefanav. Avraham turns to God and says, Ribon Haolim, Master of the worlds, Adam ubuno nichnasim lamakom ve'in Adam yodei lemim mechabed. A father and son enter into a room, into a place, and nobody knows who to give honor to. Mitoch she'ata me'atro b'zikna, ata yodei lemim mechabed. Why does people not know? Because we look the same. Avram is saying something very fascinating. He's saying there was no aging in his time. So when people looked at me, says Abraham, and people looked at Yitzchak, and we have very similar faces, they don't know who to give honor to. Who is the older one? Who is the father? Who is the child? Because visually, we seem to look the same. And so Abraham says, I implore you, please allow for this aging process to differentiate between me and my son. Amar lo hakadosh baruch hu chayecha, I swear, davar tov tavata, you have asked for a good thing, and it's going to begin with you. Says the Midrash, mitchilat hasefer v'ad kan, from the very beginning of Sefer Breshit to this verse in our Parsha, chapter 24, pasuk aleph, from the beginning of Breshit to this verse, Ein Ketiv Zikna, you find no mention of old age by anybody in all the chronicles from the beginning of Sefer Breshit. The Kevan She'amad Avraham Natan Lo Zikna, and when Avraham got up and pleaded God, please make this possible for the aging to be visible and differentiate. Hadahu Dichtiv, and then we find this verse, the Avraham Zakein. So this midrash, of course, is pointing out the fact that the word Zakein is very first time it's associated with somebody, it's associated with Abraham. Why Abraham? Abraham asks for old age. So this idea of old age is the second time that it's possibly appearing in the Parsha. We talked about the first notion about young and old, and whether or not old age and youthfulness is something we have to consider. But now Abraham is much more explicitly, according to the Midrash, asking for it, and it is an explicit reference to Abraham's age. Rabbi Shimshon Pincus was a rabbi in Israel, American, made Aliyah, became a very, very well-known teacher, especially in the Haredi community. He was a prolific teacher, a prolific writer, and a lot of his works actually are still read today. There are a lot of books published by him on all sorts of topics. And one of them is called Tiferet Shimshon, in which he writes essays on the Parsha, amongst other things. And when it comes to this pasuk in this week's Parsha, he has some interesting things to say about this relationship between old age and not old age. And he tries to describe it not just in old age, but past, present, and future. So when Abraham asked to become visibly old, What was he asking for? Was he asking because there was a practical benefit from it? It sounds like it. It's possible to think that Abraham wanted to appear to be old so that people would not confuse him with his son, which apparently was happening. But the Chachamim in the various Midrashim take it one step further. They sort of peel back a couple of layers and suggest that there's more to it than that. It wasn't just a utilitarian perspective that Abraham was sharing with God and with us. There's something more about that. That Abraham wanted to look old, not because to differentiate between what he looks like and what Yitzhak looks like, but because he felt there was something majestic about looking old. And the Midrash, which I'm not going to read because of time, suggests that that is what he's asking. He wants to look a certain way. And that way is he wanted to look old. He wanted that white beard. He wanted that visual perception, that visual image of an older person. Now, that's so not 2025, so not. Like if you ask people, what would you prefer? There's so much industry that's been established in order to preserve youth, and that old age is something that we certainly don't want to embrace. We try to push it off. We try to make us look much younger than we actually are because for a reason that is perhaps sociological, we connect old age with things that we want to distance ourselves from, whereas Abraham had a completely different idea. So why is that? Like, what's behind this? Rabbi Pincus, in his book, makes the following interesting suggestion. He says, past, present, and future. Is one of those more important than the other? Well, you might think that, well, look, the past is gone. You can't change the past. And so if you think about where you're going to have the greatest impact, you can say, well, the future, because I can't change the past, but there still is time to do things differently or make an impact. So maybe future is where we ought to consider investing our efforts. The future, past, present, future, it's got to be the future. Possibly. However, it is also possible to say that the future is so uncertain. I don't know about the future. It's true, I can't change the past, but the future may not be any better. I don't know what to do. I can't control the future. And I don't know whether or not it's going to be better. So of the past, present, and future, which part should I really be trying to invest in? But I think it says it's the present. It's not the past. Can't change that. And the future, you have no control over. The only moment you have any sort of ability to influence is right now. And so he suggests that it's the present tense that should be getting much of our attention. And maybe that's what Avram is saying. I want now. I want to look a certain way now, not just because of the help it may bring in differentiating me between my kid, but I want to look a certain way now. And it's an interesting idea to consider how we feel about those of us. Well, we're all aging, everybody's aging, that's clear. But how we feel about when we reach that in our shul, it's an interesting thing. I don't know, announcements in shuls maybe. I don't know whether there's some sort of chokhmah or there's some sort of tradition, but Mazel Tov to Jack so and so on reaching his special birthday. Like, we don't want to actually mention the number. We're just going to say it's his special birthday. Because if we mention the number, oh no, like, mention the number. Like, what? Like, why not mention the number? Baruch Hashem. Don't you want to be amongst those who age? Because there's only one group of people I know who don't age anymore. And I don't want to be part of that group. I want to be part of the people who do age. And so this whole notion of Babi Amin, he became older, he became a Zaken, may not be this symbol of weakness and deterioration and sort of, oh no, 1 foot out the door, we got to figure this out. Avraham is saying, I don't see it that way. And Rabbi Pink is saying, Avraham is looking at this koach, this impact in the present. Okay, so talking about this particular chapter, chapter 24, Avraham realizes he's not going to be the one to go back home and to execute this plan. Who will be the person to execute the plan? It's going to be his servant. And his servant, I'm going to read the verse. Vayomer Avraham el avdo zikan beito hamoshel bechol asher lo simna yadcha tachot yirehi. So Avram turns to his servant, whom this pasuk does not name, but we know him as Eliezer, the elder of his household, who controls all that is his. So Eliezer is this man who has been given a lot of trust. By the way, Eliezer is also his trusted servant, who Avram called upon to help liberate Lot when he was caught in the war in Sodom, and he liberated Lot from Sodom. Well, that was Eliezer. And Eliezer is mentioned a little bit earlier, but it was him, Eliezer, whom Avram sends on this amazing journey. And for the most part, Chazal speak favorably about Eliezer. In fact, it's probably okay to say that not only do they speak favorably, they probably speak very complimentarily. They speak glowingly about Eliezer. He's actually in one of the Masechtot, he's listed among the 7 righteous people, listen to this, who were brought alive into Gan Eden, meaning that's how righteous he is. He has his chelik in Gan Eden, according to this. And the Gemara also in Sechet Yoma suggested Eliezer was the one who spread Avraham's Torah and teachings. He was faithful. He learned from his Rebbe. He was like the Talmud Muvak. He was the exceptional student who learned everything that Avraham said and would gladly say it over to whoever wanted to hear it. But here's a really fascinating piece of Torah. There is one source in the Midrash. It's in the collection called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And in this Midrash, Eliezer is identified with another biblical character. He's identified with Og. So you may or may not be familiar with that name. So Og is the giant who ruled over the portion of land called Bashan. And he, Og, attacked Bnei Israel shortly before they entered into Eretz Israel. So there are probably a lot of things saying, wait a second, how's that even possible? Don't they live in 2 different eras? I understand that. But just for one moment, let's suspend the sort of details about this to understand, peel off what were the Chacham getting at. So on one hand, we have Eliezer identified as this amazing servant, a tremendous Talmud Chacham, a person who faithfully disseminated Avram's Torah. And on the other hand, it may be only one midrashic source, but it's a midrashic source that I think we can't simply dismiss, that said that Eliezer could also be this guy called Og, who became an enemy to the Jewish people. And so that's clearly a description of a negative light. And what does that mean? Like, why do that? So here's an idea that I think is worth just considering. So you have one person that has sort of 2 very different descriptions about who he is. Is he good or is he bad? Is he a positive character or is he a negative character? But maybe what the Chachamim are trying to say, I mean, one answer is, yeah, well, you have different opinions, different people. Somebody saw him in a positive light, somebody saw him in a negative light. It's possible, it's clear. But I wonder whether or not, if we take a look at the body of rabbinic literature as somehow a single unit, and I know that that may be stretching it because even within rabbinic literature, there's so many differences of opinion, so many machlokas, and so many controversies and disagreements. But maybe there's a deeper message that can also emerge from this, where we see this as part of a continuum rather than 2 opinions which are so contrary they can't coexist. Is it possible for one person to somehow represent 2 points, pious as well as bad? Is it possible that we can see human beings as way more complex than we sometimes see? We like to paint people with a single paintbrush of one color. They're monochromatic. You're this or you're that. You're right or you're left. You're for us, you're against us. You're white or you're black. You're good or you're evil. And maybe the fact that the Chachamim saw Eliezer is a much more complex person. There were parts about who he was which are so complimentary, so laudable, so amazing, but there was a side to him that may be more devious. There may be a side to him that's not so clean, not so white. And is that not real life? Aren't there people in our lives, in our spheres of influence, or we come in contact to, that have multi parts to their character? That there may be things that they've done which we would give compliments to, but there may be things that they've done that we would harshly criticize. And perhaps that's one of the things that the Chachamim are trying to impart to us when it comes to the story of Eliezer. I see it's 9:01, and I'm hoping that you guys give me just a little bit more time. I want to end with one idea. So the story of Abraham's, of Eliezer's mission to fulfill Abraham's um, goal of bringing back a wife for Yitzhak concludes, and I just want to share with you the following idea. So as the Torah describes this, Yitzchak obviously is aware of what's going on. It's not as though Abraham kept this as a secret. So apparently, as Eliezer's coming back with the entourage, Torah tells us that Yitzchak leaves his home and he goes to a field. Yitzchak ba mibo be'er lachai ro'i v'hu yoshev be'eretz hanegev. Isaac came from having gone to be'er lachai ro'i. So as Rivka and Eliezer are approaching, Yitzchak is returning. He seems to have gone away from his home, his tent, to a place called be'er lachai ro'i. And it says the following: Yitzchak went out to lasuach basadeh, literally means to converse in the field. This particular, the Stone translation uses the Rashi interpretation that he didn't just go out to talk. There was nobody he was talking with because he went out by himself. He went out actually to pray, to supplicate in the field towards evening. And he raised his eyes and saw, behold, camels are coming. And he sees that Eliezer is coming, and he knows what it's about. He knows that there's a woman with him. And don't forget, Yitzhak is not a little kid. He's an older man by now. And I'm sure that Avram explained to Yitzhak what is coming. So Rabbi Zalman Saratskin, a Holocaust survivor, actually settled in Israel. He was known as a Lutzker Rav before the war, and he wrote a commentary to the Torah called Oznaim La Torah. And on this pasuk, where it says that Yitzhak came from the place of Be'er Lachai Roli, he says, this story about Yitzhak's traveling to a place and then coming home in time to meet his betrothed wife, he says there are three lessons that he thinks are worth considering. Number one, Ein al banim limnoa ba'ad avihem, shemeta alav ishto ki imam. That children should not prevent their father, or I guess mother, who lost their spouse from remarrying. Now, why did Yitzchak go to this place, according to the rabbis? He actually went there to bring back a woman for his father to marry. He brought back the woman called Hagar that Sara had told Avram needs to be kicked out of the house. She had left. She had changed according to some rabbinic traditions, and Yitzchak said, I don't want my father to live by himself anymore. I want Hagar, who obviously Avraham knew, to come back and to marry him again. And so what Rabbi Saratskin says, it's a mistake for children to prevent their parents who lost their spouse from remarrying. Even though it may not be easy, he says, one, they should not be doing that. Number one, interesting lesson. Lesson number two, before a person gets married, he should daven. Yitzhak knows that this Eliezer is coming back with his wife. And so he goes out into a field, a quiet moment, lasuach lasadeh. He's supposed to pray to God. And that should be one of the things, precursors, that should be one of the things that a young man and a young woman do before they get married. They should realize that their tefillot matter, and that just like Isaac went into the field to pray to God, so too should the chatan or kala be praying to God before the wedding. And number three, before one enters into this moment of prayer, one needs to confess. We need to confess what we've done wrong. By the way, there was a custom on the day of the wedding for the Chatan and Kala, especially the Chatan, before the Chuppah, they daven, but they also recite the vidui, the confession that's recited on Erev Yom Kippur. And so Rav Sorotsky reminds us that before the Chuppah, the idea of confessing things that we've done wrong is in fact an entirely appropriate response. And Yitzchak, apparently, says Rabbi Sorotsky, did that as well. How did he do that? Well, by going to bring back Hadar, says Rabbi Sorotsky, Yitzchak was trying to deal with a big sense of guilt that he had in his life. Now, he wasn't behind Hagar's expulsion with Ishmael, but he knew the story. He wasn't a little kid. Yitzchak wasn't a baby when Sara insisted that Abraham send Ishmael away. And likely, Yitzchak understood what was going on, that his mother didn't want Ishmael to be with him, that somehow Yitzchak needed to be the protected kid. And Yitzchak may have developed, this is all according to Rabbi Sorotsky, this sense of responsibility, that what happened somehow wasn't exactly his fault, but it was about him. And he never felt 100% shalem. He never felt 100% good about that. And so now at this point in his life, he's about to enter into his own chuppah. He's about to get married, and he's looking to make right something that he felt he had a part of that just didn't end up properly. And so he goes and he finds Hagar, who had changed her life according to rabbinic traditions, and he brought her back home, and she had a new name now. She sort of underwent some reawakening spiritually, and instead of the name Hagar, according to the end of the Parsha, her new name is Keturah. And Keturah, from the word Ketoret, as some of them say, from the word incense, she smelled differently. She had a completely different aura about her. But the point that Sorotskin says, I found interesting, is that sometimes we carry around a certain type of guilt about things that we do, and especially as we enter into our new phase of life, as we commit ourselves to a spouse in the future, we need to perhaps look at those things and make them right, so that when we enter into a chuppah, when we build our lives together, we build it with our full selves and not bearing any baggage that needed to be cleansed. So that's Parsha Chayei Sara, and I invite everybody to unmute, and I'm more than happy to hear some of your thoughts about tonight's shiur.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Okay, about Eliezer. And to me, that was quite a comment trying to compare Eliezer with Og. But what I want to ask is, what did Eliezer actually do to make him think that he's like Og?
So that's a really good question. There are through a very, very close reading of this very long story, you see that there's certain things that Eliezer took upon himself that might have indicated something self-interest was going on. One of the things was that according to tradition, Eliezer had a daughter, and his secret wish was that Abraham let Yitzchak marry his daughter, which Abraham had no intention of doing. And so there may be this element of his wanting to do that which was best for him, and not necessarily that which was best for Yitzchak, and certainly not for Abraham. So there's that somehow that mixture of, he seems to be loyal, he seems to be trustworthy, he is described as a faithful servant, but people are people, Charlie, and sometimes good people end up making bad mistakes. That's what I think that comparison between Eliezer and Og is trying to suggest. And for us, the question is, I think, and I don't have an answer, I'm just throwing it out there. So in cases like that, like, where do you come down? Is the good part of them what we see? Is the bad part of them what we ignore, or is it the other way around? Or how do we navigate that when people are multidimensional? They are. And so how do we treat them? How do we figure out what to do in a situation where people have a combination of all sorts of character traits? I think it's an interesting question. And is it just a personal thing? Is it more than a personal thing? Andy, I think I saw you. Andy?
Well, in my simple-minded way, um, I looked up where Bashan is
Yeah,
because I thought I knew, but I wasn't sure. So Eliezer is from Dameshek,
yeah.
and Dameshek, if it's not in Bashan, it's next door.
Okay.
So I think maybe the Midrash is saying it doesn't have to be exactly the same person, but it's interesting that they're from the same locale. And what do we make of that?
That is interesting. That is interesting. So perhaps, he ultimately goes back to where he came from, and he goes to where he's most comfortable, where our birthplace, the place that we spent our earliest years, are the places that affect us deeply. That could be an interesting idea. But Og is not just a statement of where you came from. I mean, Og is a character in the Chumash who does some terrible things. He's an enemy of the Jewish people. He tries to kill Moshe Rabbeinu. So he represents a certain type of villain, I guess. So sometimes when the Chachamim are trying to make a point, they draw something very starkly, and they sort of try to have two poles which are really different and presented in order to make a point. And I wonder what that's what's going on here. On the one hand, Eliezer is this amazing servant. On the other hand, he seems to be associated with somebody who's really evil. So again, is it possible to have somebody, the same person like that? I mean, I'm not talking about a person who is mentally unstable, just talking about generally, which is an interesting question, I think. Thank you, Andy.
Bye-bye.
Oh, Marty's online. Hi, Marty. I'm so happy to see you.
I was on my last week where I was so tired still from being away that I think it was very tiring. So I I have a question about uh, the Yitzchak being uh, Yaakov's other second son and Sarah only having one son.
Mhm.
When Abraham goes to the Akedah, the Torah refers to Ishak as Ishak, your only son. And it's interesting that gets carried into to the davening we 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 do every morning. Yitzchak is called the Yitzchak. So how do you reconcile that with this midrash that you talked about?
Well, the word Yechidka, I mean, that's the Rashi. There's a Rashi there when God instructs Abraham about the Akedah, Kachna et bincha et Yechidka asher ahavta et Yitzchak. And the Midrash tries to explain why it was necessary for God to give Abraham all these descriptives of the son that he was intending. Kachna et bincha. And Abraham says, I have two sons. I have Yishmael and I have Yitzchak. Kachna et bincha et Yechidka. No, I want you to take the son that comes from your wife, the singular wife. And he says, well, Hagar is also part of my family. Asher ahavta, I want you to take the son that you love. And he says, well, I love both my sons. And then finally, God identifies the person that he has in mind, says Yitzchak. So from this sort of dialogue, which is understood, it's not explicit in the text. The text is trying to say that in Abraham's mind, as he was hearing this, it was not immediately evident to him that God was referring to Yitzchak, because Abraham had this sense of both of his sons, and he related to them in a way that I'm not exactly sure it was equal, but he loved them both. And it was Sara who had to sort of, at some point, had to sort of wake him up and say, you can't do that. You can't treat them the same. They're not the same. They may be the same in your eyes, but Sarah had to say they're not the same in my eyes. And that's what God said. She's right. And we've got to sort of see it her way and do what she says. So the words, this particular midrash, which Rashi quotes as the pshat as to why it has those descriptors, Bincha, Yechidka, Ahavta, and Yitzchak, those four, is because Abraham was able to sort of in his own differentiate between the two in a way that created equivalence between them. It was clear that wasn't possible. Anybody else want to share a thought or a question? Guys, you got to wake up a little bit. You got to keep niggle busting here at the end of the year.
Rabbi,
Yeah. Oh, Charlie, go ahead. Yes.
back to the Eliezer thing, okay? If Eliezer has a daughter, he would like to marry Yitzchak. And all the more so, Eliezer is even greater because he actually went through with Rivka marrying instead of his daughter.
Right.
So he's even a greater person.
You're not wrong. There are parts of the story, if you take a look at the rabbinic interpretation, are parts of the story where he seems to try to insert his daughter. This is not explicit in the text, unless you read it very carefully through the lens of the rabbis. He may have tried to insert his daughter in the process. Of course, that's not what happened. So in that sense, you're right. He did his mission. Avraham asks him to swear to do his mission, and he swears, and he goes and he brings back Rivka. So in that case, you're absolutely right. So he's a faithful servant. He did what he needed to do, and he did it. But there is this other subtext that exists amongst the Chachamim, that there are things about Eliezer that were more, I don't know what the word is, suspect, I guess. You can't take away from what he did. He did what he was asked to do, but we don't also ignore the other aspect. Creating, as I said, that sort of multidimensional person. That's which part, how do we relate to that?
But it's also human nature.
Yeah. Well, that's the point I'm making, is that I think what the Torah tries to do, just about every story, is it's not talking about people who are not humans. It's trying to give us instruction about us, our lives. So when we find the humanity in Logos, that's where I think we learn from them. That's where I think the greatness is. What I just said to you now, Charlie, by the way, there would be a whole genre of reading Chumash which would disagree with what I just said, and would not seek to find the humanity in our ancestors, but rather want to establish their angel-like qualities. They're more closer to Malachim than they are to Bnei Adam, and we need to review them in that sense. That's definitely a existing methodology in studying about them. As you can hear from me, and if we learned a lot together, to know that I find more meaning the other way. That is seeing the humanity in our avot, recognizing their greatness through their humanity or because of their humanity. Okay, so I'm going to wish everybody a wonderful week, a week of bracha, a week of simcha, a week of mitzvah, a week of nachas, a week of shalom. May the remaining bodies of the bodies of the remaining hostages be brought back for Kever Yisrael. Hagar Golden, like that was an amazing 11 years. The 11 years there, his parents had to wait 11 years. May it spare the families of the other soldiers so that they can be brought back to Kever Yisrael. And
Amen.
Hashem bless the Jewish
Amen.
people with peace.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank
I
you,
really
Rabbi.
appreciate the chance to learn Torah with you every week.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks very much.
You're
Thank you.
very
Good
much.
night.
Thank you very much.